Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. We in our second installment of Ruma Pompilius. A foul suspicion presently attached itself to the patricians, and rumors were current among the people, as if they, weary of kingly government and exasperated of late by the imperious deportment of Romulus towards them, had plotted against his life and made him away, that so they might assume the authority and government into their own hands. This suspicion they sought to turn aside by decreeing divine honors to Romulus, as to one not dead, but translated to a higher condition. And Proculus, a man of note, took oath that he saw Romulus caught up into heaven in his arms and vestments, and heard him as he ascended cry out that they should hereafter style him by the name of Quirinius. This trouble being appeased was followed by another, about the election of a new king, for the minds of the original Romans and the new inhabitants were not as yet grown into that perfect unity of temper, but that there were diversities of factions amongst the commonalty, and that it was necessary to have a king. Yet what person are of what nation was matter of dispute. For those who had been builders of the city with Romulus, and had already yielded a share of their lands and dwellings to the Sabines, were indignant at any pretension on their part to rule over their benefactors. On the other side, the Sabines could possibly allege that at their king Tatius's decree that they had peaceably submitted to the sole command of Romulus, so now their turn was come to have a king chosen out of their own nation, nor did they esteem themselves to have combined with the Romans as interferers, nor to have contributed less than they to the increase of Rome, which without their numbers and association could scarcely have merited the name of a city. Thus did both parties agree and dispute their cause, but lest meanwhile discord, in the absence of all command, should occasion general confusion, it was agreed that the 150 senators should interchangeably execute the office of supreme magistrate, and each in succession, with the ensigns of royalty, should offer the solemn sacrifices and dispatch public business for the space of 6 hours by day and 6 by night, which vicissitude and equal distribution of power would preclude all rivalry amongst the senators and envy from the people, when they should behold one elevated to the degree of a king, leveled within the space of a day to the condition of a private citizen. This form of government is termed by the Romans interregnum, nor yet could they, by this plausible and modest way of rule, escape suspicion and clamor of the vulgar, as though they were changing the form of government to an oligarchy, and designing to keep the supreme power in a sort of wardship under themselves, without ever proceeding to choose a king. Both parties came at length to the conclusion that the one should choose a king out of the body of the other. The Romans make a choice of a Sabine, or the Sabines name a Roman. This was esteemed the best expedient to put an end to all party spirit, and the prince who should be chosen would have an equal affection to the one party as his electors, and to the other as his kinsmen. The Sabines remitted the choice to the original Romans, and they too, on their part, were more inclinable to receive a Sabine king elected by themselves than to see a Roman exalted by the Sabines. Consultations being accordingly held, they named Numa Pompilius of the Sabine race, tribe, really, a person of that high reputation for excellence, that though he were not actually residing at Rome, yet he was no sooner nominated than accepted by the Sabines, with acclamation almost greater than that of the electors themselves. The choice being declared and made known to the people, principal men of both parties were appointed to visit and entreat him that he would accept the administration of the government. Numa resided at a famous city of the Sabines called Cures, whence the Romans and Sabines gave themselves the joint name of Quirites. Pomponius, an illustrious person, was his father, and he the youngest of his 4 sons, being, as it had been divinely ordered, born on the 21st day of April, the day of the foundation of Rome. He was endued with a soul rarely tempered by nature, and disposed to virtue, which he had more subdued by discipline, a severe life, and the study of philosophy, means which had not only succeeded in expelling the baser passions, but also the violent and rapacious temper, which barbarians are apt to think highly of. True bravery, in his judgment, was regarded as consisting in the subjugation of our passions by reason. Because if you're doing just what you feel like, it's not really brave, it's just being impulsive. He banished all luxury and softness from his own home, and while citizens alike and strangers found in him an incorruptible judge and counselor, in private he devoted himself not to amusement or lucre, but to the worship of the immortal entities, and rational contemplation of their divine power and nature. So famous was he that Tatius, the colleague of Romulus, chose him for his son-in-law, and gave him his only daughter, which, however, did not stimulate his vanity to desire to dwell with his father-in-law at Rome. He rather chose to inhabit with his Sabines and cherish his own father in his old age. And Tatia also preferred the private conditions of her husband before the honors and splendor she might have enjoyed with her father. She is said to have died after she had been married 13 years, and then Numia, leaving the conversation of the town, betook himself to a country life, and in a solitary manner frequented the groves and fields consecrated to the entities, passing his life in desert places. And this, in particular, gave occasion to the story about the female entity, namely that Numa did not retire from human society out of any melancholy or disorder of mind, but because he had tasted the joys of more elevated intercourse, and admitted to celestial wedlock in the love and converse of the female entity Egeria, had attained to blessedness and to a divine wisdom. Now, there's a lot of stories of jinn companions and jinn lovers, so, it's not Tannhauser. Is it Tannhauser? Is that the German myth about, goes off and a year and a day and the place where the, with the fairy companions, as people would call them, but, I'm exactly sure which myth, but the story evidently resembles those very ancient fables which the Phrygians have received and still recount of Attis. The Bithynians of Herodotus, the Arcadians of Endymion, not to mention several others, were thought blessed and beloved of the entities. Nor does it seem strange if God, a lover not of horses or birds but men, should not disdain to dwell with the virtuous and converse with the wise and temperate soul, though it be altogether hard indeed to believe that any thing that would be called a god or daemon is capable of a sensual or bodily love and passion for any human form or beauty, though indeed the wise Egyptians do not plausibly make the distinction. It may be possible for a divine spirit so to apply itself to the nature of a woman as to embreed in her the first beginnings of generation, while on the other side they conclude it impossible for the male kind to have any intercourse or mixture by the body with any divinity, not considering, however, that what takes place on the one side must also take place on the other, which is the arguments of the hidden imam and stuff like that. But that's not always the case. But if you're saying it's possible on here, then you could say it's possible on the other. Intermixture by force of terms is reciprocal. Yeah, that's often the thing. When putting it in the Christian terms. And God told Mary, "You will bear me a child, or you will burn in hell," or however they're going to phrase that. Where's consent there? Or Zeus chasing some poor woman? Hey, I have power over you. Well, the personification of Zeus, same thing. Same claim. Not that it is otherwise than befitting to suppose that the entities feel towards men affection and love, in the sense of affection, and in the form of care and solicitude for their virtue and their good dispositions, and therefore it was no error of those who feign that Phorbas, Hyacinthus, and Admetus were beloved by Apollo, or that Hippolytus, the Sicyon, was so much in his favor that as often as he sailed from Sicyon to Kirha, the Pythian prophetess uttered this heroic verse, expressive of the entity's attention and joy. Now doth Hippolytus return again, and venture his dear life upon the main. It is reported also that Pan became enamored of Pindar for his verses, and the divine power rendered honor to Hesiod and Archilochus after their death, for the sake of the Muses. There is a statement also that Asclepius sojourned with Sophocles in his lifetime, of which many proofs still exist, and that when he was dead another entity took care for his funeral rites. And so if any credit may be given to these instances, why should we judge it incongruous that a like spirit of the entities should visit Seleucus, Minos, Zoroaster, Lycurgus, and Numa, the controllers of kingdoms, and legislators for the commonwealths? Nay, it may be reasonable to believe that these entities, with a serious purpose, assist at the councils and serious debates of such men, to inspire and direct them, and visit poets and musicians, if at all in their more sportive moods. But for difference of opinion here, the Bacchylides said, "The road is broad, for there is no absurdity in the account also given, that Lycurgus and Numa, and other famous lawgivers, having the task of subduing perverse and refractory multitudes, and of introducing great innovations themselves, made this pretension to divine authority, which, if not true, assuredly was expedient for the interest of those it was imposed upon. And slightly misspoke there, that his name was Bacchylides. That wasn't just Numa was about 40 years of age when the ambassadors came to make him offers of the kingdom, and speakers were Proculus and Valessus, one or other of whom it had been thought the people would elect as their new king, the original Romans being for Proculus and the Sabines for Valessus. Their speech was very short, supposing that, when they came to tender a kingdom, there needed little to persuade to acceptance, but contrary to their expectations, they found that they had to use many reasons and entreaties to induce one that lived in peace and quietness to accept the government of a city whose foundation and increase have been made in a manner in war. In presence of his father and his kinsman Marcius, he returned answer that every alteration of man's life is dangerous to him, but madness only could induce one who needs nothing and is satisfied with everything to quit a life he is accustomed to, which, whatever else it is deficient in, at any rate has the advantage of certainty over one wholly doubtful and unknown. Though, indeed, the difficulties of this government cannot even be called unknown, Romulus, who first held it, did not escape the suspicion of having plotted against the life of his colleague Tatius, nor the Senate the like accusation of having treasonably murdered Romulus. Yet Romulus had the advantage to be thought divinely born and miraculously preserved and nurtured. My birth was mortal, I was reared and instructed by men that are known to you, the very points of my character that are most commended mark me as unfit to reign, love of retirement and of studies inconsistent with business, a passion that has become inveterate in me for peace and for unwarlike occupations, and for the society of men whose meetings are but those of worship and of kindly intercourse, communication, whose lives in general are spent upon their farms and their pastures. What are they, Epicureans? I should be, methinks, a laughing-stock, while I should go about to inculcate the worship of the entities and give lessons in the love of justice and the abhorrence of violence and war to a city whose needs are rather for a captain than for a king. The Romans, perceiving by these words that he was declining to accept the kingdom, were the more instant and urgent with him that he would not forsake and desert them in this condition, and suffer them to relapse, as they must, into the former sedition and civil discord, there being no person on whom both parties could accord, but on himself. And at length his father and Marcius, taking him aside, persuaded him to accept a gift so noble in itself, and tendered to him rather from heaven than from men, though they said, you neither desire riches, being content with what you have, nor court the fame of authority, as having already the more valuable fame of virtue, yet you will consider that government itself is a service of God, who now calls out into action your qualities of justice and wisdom, which were not meant to be left useless and unemployed. Cease, therefore, to avoid and turn your back upon an office which, to a wise man, is a field for great and honorable actions. for the magnificent worship of the entities, and for the introduction of habits of piety, which authority alone can effect amongst a people. Tatius, though a foreigner, was beloved, and the memory of Romulus has received divine honors. And who knows but that this people, being victorious, may be satiated with war, and content with the trophies and spoils they have acquired, may be above all things desirous to have a pacific and justice-loving prince to lead them to good order and quiet. But if indeed their desires are uncontrollably and madly set on war, were it not better than to have the reins held by such a moderating hand as is able to divert that fury in another way, and that your native city and the whole Sabine nation should possess in you a bond of goodwill and friendship with this young and growing power? With these reasons and persuasions, several auspicious omens are said to have concurred, and the zeal also of his fellow citizens, who, on understanding what message the Roman ambassadors had brought him, entreated him to accompany them, and to accept the kingdom as a means to unanimity, and concord between the nations. In English, we pronounce things different, and so switching from one word to another sometimes stifles me. Numa, yielding to these inducements, having first performed divine sacrifice, proceeded to Rome, being met in the way by the Senate and people. You know, the S and P and SPQR, right? Who, with an impatient desire, came forth to receive him. The women also welcomed him with joyful acclamations, and sacrifices were offered for him in all the temples. And so universal was the joy that they seemed to be receiving, not a new king, but a new kingdom. In this manner he descended into the forum, where Spurius Vetius, whose turn it was to be interrex at that hour, put it to the vote, and all declared him king. Then the regalities and robes of authority are brought to him, but he refused to be invested with them until he had first consulted and been confirmed by the entities. So, being accompanied by the priests and augurs, he ascended the Capitol, which at that time the Romans called the Tarpeian Hill. Then the chief of the augurs covered Numa's head, and turned his face towards the south, and standing behind him laid his expectation of some auspicious signal from the entities. It was wonderful, meantime, with what silence and devotion the multitude stood assembled in the forum, in similar expectation and suspense, till auspicious birds appeared and passed on the right. Then Numa, appareling himself in his royal robes, descended from the hill to the people, by whom he was received and congratulated with shouts and acclamations of welcome as a holy king and beloved of all the entities. The first thing he did at his entrance into government was to dismiss the band of 300 men which had been Romulus's lifeguard, called by him Celeris, saying that he would not distrust those who put confidence in him, nor rule over a people that distrusted him. The next thing he did was to add to the 2 priests of Jupiter and Mars a third in honor of Romulus, whom he called the Flamen Coronalis. The Romans anciently called the priests Flamines, by corruption of the word Pilamines, from a certain cap which they wore, called Pileus. In those times Greek words were more mixed with the Latin than at present. Thus also the royal robe, which is called lana jubaces, is the same as the Greek klana, and that the name of Camillus, given to the boy with both his parents living, who serves in the temple of Jupiter, was taken from the name given by some Greeks to Mercury, denoting his office of attendance on the entities. When Numa had, by such measures, won the favor and affection of the people, he set himself without delay to the task of bringing the hard and iron Roman temper to somewhat more of gentleness and equity. Plato's expression of a city in high fever was never more applicable than to Rome at that time, in its origin formed by daring and warlike spirits, whom bold and desperate adventure brought thither from every quarter. It had found in perpetual wars and incursions on its neighbors, to its after sustenance and means of growth, and in conflict with danger of source of new strength, like piles which the blows of the hammer served to fix into the ground, were for Numa, judging it no slight undertaking to mollify and bend to peace the presumptuous and stubborn spirits of this people, began to operate upon them with the sanctions of religion. He sacrificed often and used procession and religious dances, in which the most commonly he officiated in person, by such combinations of solemnity with refined and humanizing pleasures, seeking to win over and mitigate their fiery and warlike tempers. At times also he filled their imaginations with religious terrors, professing that strange apparitions had been seen and dreadful voices heard, thus subduing and humbling their minds by a sense of supernatural fears. Now, a lot of these things, it's like it's more the resistance to the reaction that's the problem, and if one chills about it, it's like, yeah. But this method which Numa used made it believe that he had been much conversant with Pythagoras, for in the philosophy of the one, as in the policy of the other, man's relations to the deity occupy a great place. It is said also that the solemnity of his exterior garb and gestures was adopted by him from the same feeling with Pythagoras, for it is said of Pythagoras that he had taught an eagle to come at his call and stoop down to him in his flight, and that as he passed among the people assembled at the Olympic Games, he showed them his golden thigh, besides many other strange and miraculous seeming practices, on which Timon the Phylacian wrote the distich, who of the glory of a juggler proud, with solemn talk imposed upon the crowd. In like manner, Numa spoke of a certain female entity or mountain nymph that was in love with him, and met him in secret as before related, and professed that he entertained familiar conversation with the Muses, to whose teaching he ascribed the greatest part of his revelations, and amongst them, above all, he recommended to the veneration of the Romans one in particular, whom he named Tacita, the Silent, which he did perhaps in imitation and honor of the Pythagorean silence. His opinion also of images is very agreeable to the doctrine of Pythagoras, who conceived the first principle as of being as transcending sense and passion, invisible and incorrupt, and only to be apprehended by abstract intelligence. So Numa forbade the Romans to represent God in the form of man or beast. Nor was there any painted or graven image of an entity admitted amongst them for the space of the first 170 years all of which time their temples and chapels were kept free and pure from images. To such baser objects they deemed it impious to liken the highest, and all access to God impossible except by the pure act of the intellect. Now, in the Bible, the whole no graven image things, it's a separate commandment. It has nothing to do whether or not you worship them or you think that God is like this. Although, it can connect to that. It was an independent commandment per se, and it actually originates in ancient Egypt. There was individuals that thought that too. Now, did they still use hieroglyphs? Yes, they still use hieroglyphs. So these writings are in hieroglyphs. His sacrifices also had a great similitude to the ceremonial of Pythagoras, for they were not celebrated with effusion of blood, but consisted of flour, wine, and the least costly offerings. Other external proofs, too, are urged to show the connection Numa had with Pythagoras. The comic writer Epicharmus, an ancient author and of the school of Pythagoras, in a book of his dedicated to Antenor, records that Pythagoras was made a freeman of Rome. Again, Numa gave to one of his 4 sons the name of Mamercus, which was the name of one of the sons of Pythagoras, from whence, as they say, sprang that ancient patrician family of Amelie, for that king gave him sport the surname of Amelius, for his engaging and graceful manner in speaking. I remember, too, that when I was at Rome, I heard many say that when the oracle directed 2 statues to be raised, one to the wisest and another to the most valiant man in Greece, they erected 2 of brass, one representing Alcibiades and the other Pythagoras. But to pass by these matters, which are full of uncertainty and not so important as to be worth our time to insist on them, the original constitution of the priest called Pontificus is ascribed unto Numa, and he himself was, it is said, first of them, and that they have the name of Pontificus from potens, powerful, because they attend the service of the entities who have power to command over all. Others make the word refer to exceptions of impossible cases.